Freud's psychosexual stages. I want you to focus just a moment on that word psychosexual stages before we go through them. I don't want you to get the word psychosexual mixed up later in this psychodynamic approach lectures with Erikson's psychosocial stages. So Freud is talking about the development of the foundation of your sexuality. Erikson, later on, will be talking about the development of your social skills. Okay. So Freud's psychosexual stages, what I want you to remember with each stage here, let me outline this, okay, is first the name, second the age range, so I will give you the age range, third the body part focus. So there's a different body part focus. The different focus on a different body part for each of these stages as we go through. Next, the psychosexual task. We'll talk about that more fully in a moment. And finally, any possible fixations in the adult personality. So something that can come out of not resolving properly the psychosexual task. Okay, so the first stage is the oral stage, and you may put for your age range here 0 and 1. So this is those years of life, 0 and 1. And the focus, the body part focus, remember, this is a theory of becoming familiar with your body and comfortable with your body. And so there's a different body part focus at each age, and this one, you can tell from the title, is going to be the mouth. And so the focus is on the mouth. And I'll tell you something, if any of you disagree with this, all of you who have experience with infants who are 0 in the first year of life, so in this range of age, know that everything and anything they get a hold of goes where? Goes into the mouth. Okay, so they're using the mouth kind of like a hand, and they're exploring everything with their mouth. And so, think about what they're doing. They're becoming familiar with their mouth. They're developing those lip and tongue and facial muscles that control the mouth and the lips and the tongue, and they're getting familiar with all the sensations that come from their taste buds, for instance. And so there really truly is, this focus on the mouth. Okay. Now, the psychosexual task, what Freud is talking about here, is not unusual situations. So he's not talking about what is the most difficult thing that a child goes through for abused children or neglected children. He's talking about a normal development at this age range. What is the most difficult thing that a child has to learn, that they have to go through? And the answer to that is weaning from the breast. Okay. And what's interesting here is if we look at the level of difficulty that infants have with this idea of coming off the breast, is that it's normally distributed, meaning that the curve is shaped like what? Shaped like a bell, right? So there's quite a bit of difficulty that most infants have with it. Okay, and so we'll say that's the average, that's the mean, right? Most infants are kind of at that average level of difficulty. No such thing as a happy camper. But I'll tell you something, we all, usually can think of circumstances, certain instances of infants, very few, maybe only one, maybe none, but oftentimes you could think that there's this very small number of infants who have no difficulty at all. So they're way over here at this end of the bell curve, right? And then there's also a small number of infants who have a lot more difficulty than normal. So that's what Freud is talking about, is those over on this end. okay, that have more difficulty with this than normal. And I want you to think about this. How many of you have known a child that was still sucking their thumbs, say, at 3 years old, or at 4 years old, or 5, or even 6, right? But think about this in terms of adult personality. How might it be displayed? As adults, you're not still seeing these individuals, even when they really had a hard time of it and were still sucking their thumbs at 6 years of age. They don't tend to do that as an adult. But it does come out, okay? And this is a fixation. This is what Freud called an oral personality. So the fixation here, the possible fixation that can result from having difficulty with this weaning off the breast, okay, is an oral personality. And how this is displayed in adults is basically the need to put something in the mouth quite often. And so there are many different possibilities. It could be overeating, okay? Or it could be displayed as over drinking, could be displayed as smoking, could be displayed as biting your fingernails often, chewing the end of pencil erasers, that kind of thing, right? Okay, so oral personality, and super interesting when you think in terms, for instance, of smoking, because it's really helps to inform us that if we have an addiction, it's very important, if we want to get over it, to know what is feeding into that addiction, what factors are involved. And if this is one of them, okay, then it can be easily replaced with something more functional like chewing gum. Okay. The next stage here is the anal stage. And the age range that you can put down is 2 and 3. So the second year and the third year. 2 and 3, ages 2 and 3. And the body part focus obviously is going to be the anus. And sometimes people's first reaction to this is disbelief. But I want you to think carefully about this, because there is no denying that when kids are 2 and 3 years old, there is a real fascination with the anus and anything that comes out of it. And I'll tell you something, one of the kids' favorite words at this stage, if they are allowed to use it, is poop. Okay? And they think they'll use it, they'll overuse that word, they'll giggle a lot when they use it. They're really fascinated with that whole concept. Okay, and I'll tell you something else. Hey, do not leave kids who are 2 and 3 years old. Don't ever leave them alone in the bathroom, whether they're your own kids or you're babysitting or whatever. Don't leave them alone in the bathroom, because there is a real fascination with the anus and anything that comes out of it, and you can end up with a real mess to clean up. Wouldn't be unusual, for instance, for them to actually wallpaper the walls with their own feces. And if there's other kids with them, they oftentimes will get them involved in it too. So there is a definite focus on the anus at this stage. Now, the psychosexual stage, or task here in Freud's theory, okay, is, again, the most difficult thing that normal kids have to get through in development in this age range is potty training. Hence our cover slide for this lecture. Okay, so think about it. No such thing again as a happy camper. Hey, it's not easy for kids to learn to control these muscles. And in fact, if we look at the difficulty level, we see that bell curve again, right? So there are some kids who are just super whizzes and learn this really fast and much easier than the rest, okay? But this level of difficulty, most kids are in the middle. And then again, we've got some kids who have a lot more trouble with it than normal. And think about that. I mean, kids' muscles develop at different rates also. So even though they all might want to really please the caretaker and learn this, they may not have that muscle control. And they could have a lot of difficulty with this, leading to fixations in the adult personality. So let's look at this, for instance. I want you to put yourself in the mind of the little child who has a lot of difficulty with this, because it can go two different ways. I want you to understand each way. So first off, it might be that the child, think about it. They've tried and tried, and they cannot please the caretaker. They are constantly making a mess, and the caretaker is upset with them, and they're not learning to make it to the toilet in time. And they're constantly disappointing the caretaker, no matter how hard they try. And so you can think of the possibility that they will become just obsessed with this idea of control. They have a high need for control, to keep themselves controlled. Okay? And this particular fixation, Freud called the retentive personality, anal retentive personality. Okay? So anal retentive personality is displayed in adulthood as very much a need for control. Behaviors that are associated are things like being excessively neat, being excessively organized, okay? Complying with social norms, for instance, okay? So being very controlled kind of personality, anal retentive personality. But there's another route that can take so much, put you back in that frame of mind of that little child who's tried so hard, okay? But no matter how hard they try, they keep disappointing the caretaker. And so the other possibility is that the child kind of comes to the conclusion that the caretaker is not being reasonable, and they stop caring, and they give up. They stop caring about trying to please the caretaker. And this leads to the fixation of anal repulsive personality. A little less well known, but anal repulsive personality in adulthood is kind of explained in the opposite way. So someone who's extremely messy, extremely sloppy, you would not want someone with an anal repulsive personality to be your roommate, most likely. And more aggressive behaviors. Now, I'll tell you something interesting, especially aggression towards women. And that's interesting because it isn't always true, but it's often the case that the mother is the one who is in charge of potty training. You can see where that would tie in. Okay? And again, like I told you, we have evidence for each of these stages, even the adult fixations. What we have are weak correlations. So if you look at, for instance, a group of people who are smokers, addicted to smoking, and those who are not, and you have their caretakers judge to what extent they had difficulty with weaning off the breast, you'll see that that difficulty mean is higher in the smokers. Okay, it's a weak correlation, so there are probably many other things that can feed into that kind of an addiction. Okay, but this does play in. Now we get to the phallic stage. Okay, and as we talk about the age range, we talk about the body focus. Again, we've got evidence for this. Okay, when we start talking about the psychosexual task and the possible fixation, that is where there is no research that supports the ideas. But let's focus on what there is first. So the age range for the phallic stage is going to be age 4 and age 5, 4th and 5th year. okay? And the phallic stage, body part focus, is now, as implied again with the name of this, is the focus is on the genitals. And, again, if you question this and you talk to individuals who have experience with kids at different ages, you'll see that when kids start touching and exploring their genitals, this is generally when it starts in this age range, the phallic stage. Okay, there is a clear focus change from the anus now to the genitals in this stage. And what's interesting too is that before Freud's teachings were really accepted, and they weren't accepted well when he first started teaching them. People were shocked, right? They had to get over the shock and really think about it more reasonably after they're over the shock. But before his teachings were really taken seriously, it was very common for kids to be pretty severely punished oftentimes for this behavior of touching or exploring their genitals. And it really is a credit to Freud that he showed this as a normal part of your psychosexual development. This is a normal part of getting to know your body, getting familiar with it, getting comfortable with it. Okay? And certainly, you don't want your kid doing this in public. Okay? And you want to reprimand them if they do at this age range, that this is something they do in public. But, this not punish them for the actual behavior itself. Now, the body part focus is on the genitals, and now with the psychosexual task and fixations, this is what there's not any evidence for. So this is where Freud's theory kind of derails in the light of the methodological revolution and all of the correlational research that was performed on these different ideas. But it's important to know these theories of Freud's and where he was coming from. Okay? So he thought that the psychosexual task for little boys was something that he called an Oedipus complex. And this is pretty fleshed out. So if you look at his readings, his writings on this, you will see that he was very prolific in writing about the Oedipus complex and fleshing this theory out. And I also want you to realize that this was likely far more common in his time than it is now, again, because of the repressed sexuality then, as far as seeing an effect later in life, leading to even physical problems, psychological problems leading to physical problems. But, okay, what was the Oedipus complex? Well, Freud thought that all little boys went through this. And this is certainly possible that some little boys still go through this, but what we know now is it is not the norm. Most little boys do not go through something like this. But here's what Freud thought all little boys go through. He thought that, some point in this age range that they really fell in love with mom. In other words, they want all of her attention. They want all of they want mom all to themselves. They want all of her attention. Well, that doesn't sound unreasonable, does it? In fact, if you ask little kids in this age range who they're going to marry when they grow up, oftentimes, boy or girl, they will say, the little boys will say that they're going to marry their mom, and the little girls will often say that they're going to marry their dad. So nothing, unusual going on yet, okay? But wait till you hear where Freud takes this. So, he believes that all little boys fall in love with mom, all of her attention, want her all to themselves. Who's in the way? Well, the major one who's in the way is dad, right? And so he thought that little boys wanted dad out of the picture. Now, I want you to think about if a little boy really wanted dad dead, what kind of guilt that could cause. on the part of the little boy, and fear, because, who is more powerful than in their mind than their dad? And who has more power over them, is capable of punishing them than their dad, right? So imagine, what Freud thought was the child's biggest fear, that dad would find out and dad would do what to them. And now, in order to see where Freud was coming from, you have to imagine kids have imaginations that are really incredible, right? And that is true. They do. Now, what is the very worst thing that the little boy could think that dad could do to him in punishment if dad knew that the little boy wanted him dead? And the answer to that in Freud's theory is castration. Worse than death, right? Castration. So Freud thought that all little boys are suffering from castration anxiety because of their Oedipus complex. And he thought the only way that a little boy can get over that, okay, is basically to give up on the idea of having mom to himself, but want what dad has in life, basically, and so they want to be like dad. And so they fashion themselves after the same-sex parent, after dad. Okay. Now, Freud was, again, writing about this and talking about this, and he really had this fleshed out, okay? And yet, people kept bugging him, because obviously they're going to think in the audience, and when they're reading all of his writings on this, okay, what's going on with little girls, right? What's up with little girls in this stage? And I'll tell you something, Freud even admitted, he talked to his colleagues. If you read his readings, he's even honest with the readers about this. His actual readings, not other people writing his stuff, but his actual readings. He talks about the idea that the Elector complex is not as fleshed out for him. So he was kind of on the spot. He had to come up with what was going on with females, but he didn't feel as comfortable talking about that and writing about that, because he didn't have those ideas fleshed out as well as the Oedipus complex. And he still felt that way on his deathbed and was relating that those feelings to his colleagues. Okay. Well, but he did come up with a kind of skeletal theory, and this was what he called the Elector complex. So he thought that all little girls at some point in this age range looked down and noticed that something was missing. And of course, he's talking about the penis. Okay. I'll tell you something that is interesting, is that there's something Freud did not take into account there. And it's something called the fallacy of normalcy, that we all have a tendency to use ourselves as a standard for what is normal, and to judge abnormalities based on what is different from us, right? Or how normal other people are to how much like us they are. We use ourselves as a standard. But, Freud didn't take this into account. He really thought, as a result of this, that females, little girls in this stage, would suffer from what he called penis envy. Okay? And again, he felt that the only way that little girls could resolve this conflict would be to give up, basically, on the idea of growing a penis, and instead identify with the same-sex parent, so identify with mom. Okay. And the fixation, so that there's no evidence for the Oedipus or Elector complex being the normal thing that happens in little kids. This is not usually what we see at all. It can happen, but it's not the norm. And there's no evidence whatsoever with the fixation, because Freud thought that the failure to resolve this properly, in other words, to identify with the same-sex parent properly, was homosexuality. And I'll tell you something, it's really great when Freud's theory is stated so clearly in terms that after the methodological revolution, and we came up with the idea of correlational analysis and how to compute that it's so easily studied. And there's absolutely no correlation whatsoever between homosexuality and somebody going through an Oedipus or Lecter complex or having difficulty coming through it, that age range, okay? Now, if you have really been paying attention, if you're really on top of things, you might be wondering why there are any more stages here. And the reason for that is that Freud said something very specific about the end of that age 5, right? Yeah, remember? He said personality was done and fixed. That would include, the foundation of your sexuality. So why in the world, in his psychosexual stages, would there be still 2 more stages coming up? When the child has reached the end of the 5th year, it should be done, right? And we're going to answer that question in our next segment.